The Old Point Ledge Lighthouse had stood against the unforgiving Atlantic for generations, a stoic finger of stone and light against the endless horizon. For 40 years, its keeper had been Alistair Finch. He was as much a part of its granite as the salt-etched stone itself, his skin weathered like driftwood, his hands gnarled by rope and cold, his eyes holding the depth of 1,000 sunrises and 100,000 waves. His life was a metronome of solitude, the polishing of the great Fresnel lens, the trimming of the wick, the slow, rhythmic climb of the winding stairs. He didn't live a life so much as he simply endured it, each day a quiet, predictable repetition of the last. But even the most steadfast routines can be broken. On that Tuesday in the autumn of 1877, a stillness fell upon the air that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The gulls, usually a cacophony of cries, were eerily silent. A heavy, bruised sky rolled in from the west, the color of old lead. Alistair, watching from his high perch, felt a familiar tremor of foreboding. He had seen storms, but this one carried a different weight, a sense of malevolent purpose. As the first gusts of wind lashed at the tower, he heard it. Not a voice, not a word, but a sound carried on the gale. It was a faint, spectral hum, a note of grief that seemed to rise from the very depths of the ocean. He dismissed it as the wind whistling through the rigging, a phantom born of his long isolation. But his heart, a stone he had kept buried for decades, gave a single, uncomfortable beat. He had spent his life guarding the shore from the sea's fury, but he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that the real storm was the one brewing not on the water, but within the dark corners of his own mind. He watched the first wave crash against the base of the lighthouse, a white fist of fury, and waited. The first wave had been a warning. The ones that followed were a siege. They struck the base of the lighthouse with the force of a battering ram, a relentless drumbeat against the granite that vibrated up through the stone and into Alistair's very bones. He retreated indoors, sealing the heavy door behind him, but the storm's presence was too large to be shut out. The tower itself groaned under the assault, its massive timbers creaking like the ribs of a dying beast. He tried to go about his work, a silent, desperate prayer for normalcy. He checked the pressure lamps, polished a speck of salt from the lens's brass casing, and wound the clockwork mechanism that rotated the light. But his hands trembled, and his mind, usually a quiet harbor of routine, was a tempest of its own. Then the whispers began. It wasn't a distinct sound at first, merely a change in the wind's howl. It was lower, more resonant, carrying an inflection that Alistair's subconscious insisted was human. A soft, sibilant hiss that seemed to snake through the cracks in the stone. He stopped his work and listened, a cold dread seeping into him. For 40 years, the sea had been a chaotic roar of white noise, a constant companion that he had long ago learned to ignore. This was different. This was deliberate. He walked to a small window facing the churning water, peering through the salt-crusted glass. A thick, clammy fog was rolling in, enveloping the lighthouse, swallowing the angry waves and the bruised sky. It was in this sudden, silent shroud that he heard it clearly for the first time. A faint, mournful whisper, a sound that held the weight of a forgotten name, his name. It was not a gale's moan, but a lament, a long-buried sorrow that the storm had unearthed and now carried on its breath. And as he watched the fog consume his world, Alistair knew with a sickening certainty that this was no ordinary storm, and the voice was no mere phantom of the wind. It was a memory, given form and given tongue, and it had come for him. The storm reached its crescendo with a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the tower. Rain didn't fall, it was driven sideways in blinding sheets, blurring the line between the sky and the sea. Alistair, now in a state of frantic agitation, could not stay inside. The whispers had become a clarion call, and he was drawn to the source of the sound with a morbid, irresistible pull. He unlatched the heavy storm door and stepped out onto the parapet, a figure of mad defiance against the wind's assault. Salt spray instantly coated his face, stinging his eyes, and the wind snatched at his coat like a desperate hand. He leaned hard against the railing, his knuckles white, and peered down into the roiling chaos below. Waves the size of small houses crashed against the rocks, their fury echoing the chaos in his mind. And there it was. Tossed like a toy in the maelstrom, A small, overturned dinghy appeared in a trough between two monstrous waves. It was a familiar sight, one that had haunted his dreams for decades. The splintered wood, the broken mast, he saw it all with a terrifying clarity. It was the boat. The very one from his past. Then, above the shriek of the wind and the pounding of the surf, the voice finally broke through. It was no longer a whisper, but a cry, a desperate, pleading shout that cut through the tempest like a knife. It called his name, Alistair, in a voice he had not heard in 40 years, a voice forever young and filled with terror. He stared, transfixed, at the dinghy. It bobbed, disappeared, and then reappeared, as if waiting for him. The line between what was real and what was merely a figment of his tortured mind had completely dissolved. The dinghy was there, and the voice was real. The ghost had not come in search of a harbor. It had come to drag him into its storm. The cry of his name shattered the present, yanking Alistair's mind from the howling gale and throwing it back into the past. The brutal lashing of rain and wind melted away, replaced by the warm caress of a summer sun. The world was suddenly vibrant with color, a sky of impossible blue, the sea a shimmering expanse of turquoise, and the rhythmic lapping of gentle waves against a small, wooden dinghy. In the boat, not the one from the storm but one just like it, sat a boy of perhaps 10 years. His name was Finn. He had a mop of unruly sandy hair, and eyes the color of the clear sky. He was clumsy but eager, fumbling with a frayed piece of rope Alistair had given him. "Like this, lad," a younger, less weathered Alistair said, his voice softer, not yet hardened by decades of solitude. He demonstrated a bowline knot, his hands swift and sure. "A rope's not just a thing to hold a sail, it's a lifeline. It's a promise." Finn's tongue poked from the corner of his mouth in concentration. "One day, I'll be the best sailor on this coast. I'll sail all the way to America and back." Alistair smiled, a genuine, joyful expression that was now a stranger to his face. "You might just do it, lad. Just remember to always look for the light. No matter how far you go, I'll be here, and the light will guide you home." Finn looked up at him, his youthful face alight with admiration. "You promise to always be there, Alistair? To always guide my boat?" "I promise," Alistair said, the words falling from his lips with the weight of a solemn oath. The sun-drenched memory shimmered and then dissolved, cracking like fragile glass. Alistair was back on the parapet, the frigid rain a shock against his skin, the wind a cruel laugh in his ears. The small, overturned dinghy was still there, a dark shadow in the churning water. The memory of his promise, once a source of pride, was now a crushing weight, the very anchor of his guilt. The boy had looked for the light, and Alistair had failed to provide it. The memory of Finn was a fragile echo, one that shattered against the immediate, brutal reality of the storm. Alistair stood on the parapet, drenched and shivering, but no longer from the cold. The storm was a deafening roar, but it was no longer the dominant sound in his world. That honor belonged to the voice. It was no longer a cry from the sea or a whisper on the wind. It was everywhere. It was in the groan of the old timber, in the shriek of the wind rushing through the lantern room, in the thud of the waves against the rock. It was a constant, nagging presence that seemed to follow him as he retreated inside, a mournful lament that repeated his name, each syllable a heavy stone dropped into the well of his conscience. He was no longer a man standing against the elements, he was a sinner being haunted by a ghost. He felt its unseen presence in every corner of the lighthouse. He imagined the small, ethereal form of the boy, cold and dripping, waiting at the base of the stairs. He pictured him hovering in the air behind him as he desperately tried to relight a lamp. The fear was a cold, constant knot in his stomach, but beneath it was a profound, unbearable guilt. "I tried, lad, I swear I did," he cried out into the empty, storm-filled room, his voice hoarse. "The rope slipped. The waves were too big. I couldn't reach you." He was a madman, confessing his sins to a specter of the mind. He sank to his knees, his hands clasped, begging for a sign of forgiveness, a moment of silence, anything to break the relentless torment. But the voice only grew louder, more insistent. It was a siren of sorrow, calling him not to a shore, but to an absolution that would never come. Alistair Finch had guarded the sea from danger for 4 decades, but now he knew with absolute certainty that he was its next victim, and the storm was only just beginning. Alistair's desperate pleas to the empty air were swallowed whole by the storm's fury. He had sunk to his knees, utterly defeated, when a sound unlike any other tore through the tempest. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the crash of the waves. It was a sharp, splintering crack, followed by a shudder that ran through the very core of the lighthouse. A powerful gust of wind had slammed into the lantern room at the very top of the tower, and in a single, devastating moment, the light died. The world outside, which had been a violent, illuminated chaos, was now a perfect, terrifying blackness. The great Fresnel lens, his one true companion, was silent. The rhythmic sweep of its beam, a beacon of hope for 4 decades, had vanished, leaving only a void. The sudden absence of the light was more shocking than any sound. It was the final betrayal, the last symbol of his purpose broken. A cold, determined anger, a feeling he hadn't known in years, replaced his despair. The ghost could torment him, but it would not take his duty. The light was his responsibility. It had to be fixed. He rose to his feet, a man possessed by a single, urgent purpose. He climbed the spiral staircase, the wind and rain now finding their way through the cracks and crevices, his path lit only by the faint flash of lightning. Each step was a struggle. The wind screamed past the windows, its voice now laced with a new, mocking note. "Why bother, old man? Who is there to save? The darkness has already won." Alistair ignored it. He was a keeper, and a keeper's job was to keep the light burning. He reached the lantern room door, forced it open against the wind's pressure, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and broken glass. The great lamp lay in pieces, a jagged, useless skeleton of metal and crystal. He stood in the silent, ruined chamber, the darkness of the night now complete, and knew he was on his own. The real battle was about to begin. The shattered lantern, the very symbol of his purpose, lay in ruins, but Alistair barely noticed. His mind was no longer on his duty to the living. It was consumed by a desperate, maddening need to atone for the dead. The ghost's cry had now become a mournful, pleading wail, and he was convinced the only way to silence it was to finally complete the rescue he had failed to perform all those years ago. He had to save Finn. Driven by this crazed, singular purpose, he abandoned the ruined lantern and descended the winding staircase with a speed born of mania. The heavy storm door at the base of the tower groaned open to his touch, and he was once more in the open, exposed to the full, unbridled fury of the gale. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, found the small, functional boat he kept on a davit at the edge of the rock. He worked with a frenzied, inhuman strength, his hands moving with an old, practiced memory, even as his mind screamed in torment. He released the winch, and the boat, a tiny, defiant vessel, creaked its way down toward the churning sea. The wind fought him at every turn, a cruel hand pushing against his back, trying to send him tumbling into the abyss. "I'm coming, lad. Just hold on," he bellowed into the wind, his voice swallowed by the thunder of the waves. The boat hit the water with a slap, immediately tossed and battered by the waves. The ghost's wail seemed to rise in a triumphant crescendo. Alistair clambered onto the slick, seaweed-covered rocks, desperately trying to pull the vessel closer so he could climb inside. He was no longer a lighthouse keeper. He was a man possessed, fighting a storm for the soul of a boy who had died decades ago. He lunged for the boat, his footing precarious, and as a monstrous wave surged toward the rock, he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that this desperate act of penance would either save him or damn him forever. A monstrous wave crashed against the rock, its cold, unforgiving face rising to meet Alistair. As the water surged over him, a jolt of icy terror ripped through his body, and the storm vanished once more. He wasn't on the rocks. He was back in the dinghy, and the sun-drenched day from his memory had curdled into a sudden, vicious squall. The sky, once a brilliant blue, had turned a malevolent shade of bruised violet. The wind was no longer a gentle breeze, but a furious gust that snatched at the sail and whipped the sea into a frenzy of whitecaps. Finn, his face a mask of fear, struggled to hold the tiller. "Alistair!" he cried, his small voice thin against the wind's shriek. Alistair reached for him, but a sudden lurch of the boat, a sharp, violent twist, threw him off balance. In that single, sickening moment, Finn lost his footing. He didn't fall so much as he simply vanished, a small, terrified gasp swallowed by the roar of the ocean. Alistair dove. The cold was a shock, a sudden, brutal slap. He thrashed through the dark, churning water, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw him, just for a moment, Finn's pale, terrified face, his eyes wide with a plea that was more heartbreaking than any sound. Alistair's hand outstretched, his fingers mere inches from the boy's. He tried, he fought, he screamed, but the water pulled Finn down with a relentless, liquid grip. Alistair watched as the last bubble of air escaped the boy's lips, his face disappearing into the green depths, leaving behind only an unbearable, aching emptiness. The memory snapped. The cold, dark water was real. Alistair was no longer watching. He was drowning. The sea had pulled him from the rocks, a vengeful hand dragging him into the abyss. He was reliving the final moments of his greatest failure, not in his mind, but in the unforgiving embrace of the very sea that had stolen Finn from him. He had promised to guide the boy home, but instead, the sea had come to collect them both. On the mainland, tucked away in the harbor village of Port Corval, the storm was a force to be weathered, not a personal war. Fishermen huddled in the warmth of the salty Anchor Tavern, sipping rum and trading tales of gales past. But all conversation fell silent at 10:15. Young Thomas, the son of the harbor master, was the first to notice. "Papa, the light!" he cried, pointing a small, trembling finger out the rain-streaked window. His father, Old Man Jensen, squinted into the night. His weathered face, usually impassive, tightened with a grim expression. "Heavens above," he muttered. "It's gone out." A collective murmur swept through the tavern. The lighthouse beam had been a constant for as long as anyone could remember, a silent, reliable sentinel that cut through the darkest of nights. Its absence felt like a cosmic betrayal. "Madman Finch, that's what he is," rasped a grizzled old fisherman named Samuel. "He talks to himself out there. Sees things. I always said he'd go mad, alone like that." Another chimed in. "They say he lost a boy out there years ago, a nephew or some such. Never been right since." The whispers spread like a chill. They all knew the legend of Alistair Finch, the ghost keeper who had turned his back on the world and become a part of the rock itself. He wasn't a man anymore, just a strange, isolated figure in a far-off tower. Now that the light was out, it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. The land had finally lost its connection to the sea. The men looked out at the black, empty space where the light should have been, a profound sense of foreboding settling over them. They didn't know if Alistair was alive or dead, but they knew one thing for certain: a light had gone out in the world, and there would be no rescue coming from the village. The monstrous wave did not just crash, it swallowed him whole. The freezing water slammed into Alistair's body, knocking the wind from his lungs and dragging him down into the chaotic, churning abyss. His desperate grip on the rock was torn away, and he was thrown into the maelstrom, a human doll in the sea's vengeful, dark embrace. Disoriented, he tumbled head over heels in the black water, the world a disorienting mix of sound and fury. The roar of the storm was a distant thrum, replaced by the suffocating weight of the ocean on his chest. Salt water burned his eyes and throat, and for a terrifying moment, he was no longer a man. He was a memory. He was Finn. This wasn't a flashback. This was a brutal, physical mirror of the past. He felt the same cold terror, the same absolute helplessness. As he fought to kick to the surface, he saw a face in the dark, swirling water. It was Finn's face, pale and ethereal, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent, accusing scream. The boy's hair floated like kelp around his face, and his ghostly hand seemed to reach out, not for help, but to pull Alistair deeper, to drag him into the crushing depths to join him. A primal, desperate need to survive fought against the pull of madness and despair. Alistair kicked, he thrashed, he fought with every last ounce of his strength. This was not just a battle against the sea, it was a battle against the ghost who had come to collect him. He had to surface. He had to breathe. He had to live, if only to face his penance on solid ground. With a final, explosive burst of energy, he kicked toward the dim, gray light of the surface, a man refusing to join his ghost in the dark. Alistair did not remember how he got there. One moment he was in the water, a desperate, fighting thing in the sea's cold grasp. The next, he was on the cold, hard floor of the lighthouse, soaked and shivering, his body a battlefield of scrapes and bruises. The storm raged on outside, but within the thick walls of the tower, there was a profound, suffocating silence. He was alone, and yet he was not. He felt the presence of the ghost more strongly than ever. It was no longer a scream from the sea, or a whisper on the wind. It was right there, in the room with him, a quiet, expectant observer. His body was a wreck, but his mind, stripped of all its defenses, was finally clear. The time for fighting was over. The time for penance had arrived. He pushed himself up, leaning against the cold stone wall, and spoke to the empty air. His voice was a raw, hoarse thing, but the words, buried for decades, finally broke free. "I let you go," he rasped, his eyes fixed on a spot in the shadows. "I held your hand, and it was slick with rain, and I told you I would pull you back, but I just couldn't. My fingers, they just slipped." Tears, hot and foreign, cut clean paths through the grime on his face. He was not talking to himself. He was confessing to his judge, laying bare a secret he had carried for 40 years. He confessed the fear that had frozen him, the shame that had made him retreat from the world, and the crushing burden of a promise he had failed to keep. "I've been so alone," he wept, the confession now a desperate, pleading prayer. "I tried to make the light burn for you, to guide you even after. But the sea, it wanted you back, and now it wants me. Please, just tell me if I've paid enough. Just tell me if I can finally rest." He slid down the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and fever. He had survived the sea, but his mind, utterly broken, had finally surrendered. He lay on the cold floor, his confession echoing in the silent room, waiting for a verdict that would never come. Alistair lay in a state of feverish delirium, his body a heavy, useless weight on the cold stone floor. The storm outside was a distant, secondary concern to the storm that raged in his mind. He was adrift in a sea of memory and madness, his confession a useless prayer that had brought no absolution. He was no longer a keeper, he was simply a ghost waiting to be claimed. A new sound, faint at first, then growing louder, cut through the din of the gale. It was the scraping of wood against rock, a jarring, unnatural noise. He forced his heavy eyelids open, his mind struggling to make sense of it. He heard a desperate shout, a human voice that was not the ghost's, but a frantic plea for survival carried on the wind. He tried to rise, but his body would not obey. He watched from his prone position as the heavy storm door at the base of the tower was violently pushed open. A man stumbled inside, collapsing against the frame. He was soaked and exhausted, his face a grim mask of weary relief. He was not a specter from the past, but a living, breathing person, a stranger who had been lost at sea. The man, a sailor with a thick beard and sharp, observant eyes, looked up, relieved to find shelter. His gaze swept the empty chamber and then fell upon Alistair lying on the floor. The sailor's face, which had been a map of exhaustion, suddenly contorted into a look of profound confusion, then cautious alarm. He had expected to find a sane keeper, a light, a fire, anything but the sight of a broken, raving madman weeping to himself on the floor. Alistair stared back, his fever-bright eyes fixed on the man. After decades of solitude and an entire night of haunting by a boy who was no longer there, the sight of a real, corporeal human was a shock so great it felt like a dream. The ghost and the madness had been his only company. Now, for the first time in an age, he was not alone. The sailor, whose name was Elias, did not see a madman. He saw a man broken by grief. He saw it in the raw, weeping gashes on Alistair's face, in the shivering of his frail body, and in the wild, pleading look in his eyes. Elias, a man of the sea himself, had seen storms both at sea and in the souls of men. He knew a wreck when he saw one. He moved with a quiet, efficient purpose. He got Alistair to his feet, guiding him gently to a chair, and wrapped a thick, woolen blanket around his trembling shoulders. He lit a small lamp, chasing the deepest shadows from the room, and poured a measure of dark rum into a tin cup, pressing it into Alistair's hands. "Take it," Elias said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "We're safe for now. The storm will have to pass." Alistair looked at the cup, then at the man. He had expected a ghost, and instead he had found a witness. The confession he had made to the empty air was now ready for a living ear. The words tumbled from his lips, not in a torrent of madness, but in the slow, halting speech of a man unburdening a lifetime of sorrow. He told Elias everything. He spoke of Finn, the promise, the sudden squall, and the moment his fingers had lost their grip. He spoke of the decades of guilt, of the ghost that had never been a ghost at all, but only the echo of his own broken heart. Elias listened without a word, his face a portrait of quiet empathy. He didn't offer platitudes or easy absolution. He simply listened, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of Alistair's pain. When Alistair's story was finished, the room fell into a profound silence. The storm howled outside, a forgotten sound. The truth, a secret so long buried, was now a shared burden. For 40 years, Alistair had been alone in the lighthouse, a prisoner to his own mind. But in the quiet, compassionate presence of a stranger, the walls of his prison had finally begun to crumble. The storm did not end so much as it simply gave up. With the coming of the new day, the furious howl of the wind began to subside, replaced by a low, consistent murmur. The rain became a fine mist, and in the east, a crack of brilliant gold split the bruised gray sky. The sun, a long-forgotten friend, cast its first rays upon the ravaged landscape. The sea, exhausted from its rage, rolled in with a new, gentler rhythm, its waves no longer crashing in fury but lapping with a quiet sigh. Alistair, awakened from his feverish sleep by the sudden calm, was a new man. The darkness in his mind had been purged by his confession, the storm in his soul stilled by Elias's quiet presence. Elias, ever practical, pointed to the shattered lantern room. "She's a beauty, that one," he said. "A shame to let her go dark." Alistair's eyes, no longer wild with madness, looked at the broken lantern, and he felt not despair, but purpose. Together, they climbed the winding stairs. Elias, with his steady hands and practical know-how, and Alistair, with his decades of knowledge of the great machine. They worked in a silent, collaborative rhythm, the new dawn their witness. They cleared the broken glass, mended the fractured parts, and carefully replaced the delicate pieces. It was not just a repair, it was a quiet, solemn ceremony of healing. And then, as the sun broke free of the horizon, they lit the wick. With a soft, steady hum, the light flickered to life. The great lens caught the flame, magnified it, and sent a brilliant, searching beam out across the peaceful sea. It was a single, perfect sweep of light, cutting through the receding mist and touching the calm horizon. It was a beacon for lost sailors, but more than that, it was a beacon for Alistair. The light had returned. The darkness had been defeated. And for the first time in 40 years, the keeper of Old Point Ledge Lighthouse knew he was home. With the storm fully past and the sea returned to a quiet swell, Elias prepared to leave. He had a small ship to find and a life to return to. The goodbye between the two men was brief, a simple nod and a firm handshake. There was nothing more to be said. Alistair had been saved, and in a way, Elias had been too. He cast off from the rock, and his small boat, guided by the steady, brilliant beam of the lighthouse, sailed away into the rising sun. Alistair was alone again. But the solitude was no longer the crushing weight it had been for so many years. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the simple, rhythmic sounds of his home. The ghost was gone. The voice was gone. The torment was over. The memories of Finn, of the boy's terrified eyes and his tragic final breath, were still with him, but they were no longer a curse. They were a part of him, a painful but essential piece of his history, no longer a chain that bound him to a living madness. He returned to his routine, but it was a different man who carried it out. He was no longer just a keeper, a man simply enduring his days. He was a guardian. He had faced the darkest part of his past, had been willing to die for it, and had somehow, miraculously, survived. He still saw the occasional dinghy bobbing in the distance, and the wind still carried a low hum, but they were just a boat and a sound. They held no power over him anymore. On the third night after the storm, Alistair stood on the parapet once more, his hands resting on the railing. The sea was a calm, dark expanse beneath a sky full of stars. He looked out across the water, and he didn't see an enemy, or a graveyard, or a place of eternal punishment. He saw the sea, a beautiful and terrible force of nature. He was its keeper, and he was at peace. The light he guided was no longer a sign of his unending penance, but a beacon of hope, a silent promise to all those who sailed the treacherous waters that even in the deepest darkness, a light could always be found.